in the UK. Emily was also previously seconded into the Capitals Coalition technical group, where she developed the Natural Capital Protocol. We then have Liam Walsh. Liam is the systems lead for food, land and oceans at Climateworks Centre in Australia. Liam leads Climateworks Centre's efforts to reduce emissions associated with the way that land is used in Australia while meeting other sustainability goals, including biodiversity conservation, meeting nutritional needs, maintaining food security. He has varied experience working across different actors across our global food systems to drive change, including with major companies and government actors in Australia, Vietnam, Kenya, Liberia and the UK. And last but not least, Dr. Sue Ogilvie leads the Farming for the Future program, a public interest research and change program that aims to provide as a public good the evidence base, the tools and resources for the agricultural sector to understand the relationship between the differences in natural capital and differences in benefits to farm businesses and farming families. By considering natural capital as a factor of agricultural productivity and profitability, Farming for the Future aims to expose the opportunity zone for where benefits for farmers and better environmental performance of environmental markets and supply chains can coexist to deliver a more financially prosperous, climate resilient and environmentally positive agricultural sector. So today's a really interesting day to be talking about nature. So it's actually Energy Day here at COP, but it also happens to be World Soil Day. And I think given we're basically at the Food and Agriculture COP. So a lot of themes will emerge today where we see kind of nature sitting at the heart of these conversations. So I'm going to run through a series of questions. This is going to be very conversational. We'll have about 40 minutes of discussion and then I'm going to be throwing to the audience. And we'll take it from there. So here we are at COP, as I said, on Energy Day. There's discussions about competition for land use and renewables. It's Soil Day. Clearly what we've discovered is that we can't separate nature and climate and land. Why, at a climate COP, do you all feel that nature is so strongly coming into frame? Emily, I'll start with you.
I think it's coming into the frame from two levels. One is the recognition from the science that we cannot achieve climate goals without nature solutions. I think that's now widely recognized, and it's a shame it took us this long to get that at the heart, but I've felt it. I've only been at COP for a day and a bit now, but I've certainly felt it really as a thread. The recognition on the science that to achieve net zero, we need to invest in nature, we need to restore, protect it. I think it's also on a practical level from the fact that, and I'm here from TNFD, which is a private sector task force from the private sector who are on the front line in many ways with complex supply chains. I know Sue's going to talk about agriculture, farmers who are seeing these interlinkages. And so as we're thinking about carbon, and climate mitigation, realizing the importance of soil, the importance of the ocean, the importance of forests, and that's then pushing up into where I'm kind of located in this ecosystem of actors around assessment and disclosure by the private sector. So they're wanting integration and pushing indeed for policymakers and regulators to be thinking about the connections between climate and nature as they think about how to assess these risks, manage these risks, of course disclose them, but also identify opportunities that can be great for the businesses and great for investors. So I think it's a sort of from the scientific recognition, from the concepts, but also from the practical application down with boots on the ground.
Liam, nature, why is it coming into frame?
Sure. So in many of the circles that I operate in, it's probably the same for other members of the panel. Increasingly, you hear people talking about climate and nature. And whilst I understand why people are using those terms, climate and nature, it's also one that's struck me as being a little bit strange in a way, because the way that I've thought about this, and others have perhaps thought about this as well, is that the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere isn't necessarily the problem. It's a symptom of a much broader problem, and that is the breakdown in the relationship between us as a species and the rest of nature. And I use that term rest of nature deliberately because, in some ways of thinking about nature, we don't really think of ourselves as being part of nature, particularly in more Western ways of thinking about this. And so, for me at least, I think, it's always been climate and nature. And I think we need to sort of see more recognition of that. And then also sort of along the lines of what Emily was saying, I think if you do take more of a net zero sort of lens and think about things, there is this increasing recognition now that even if we drastically reduce emissions at the scale that's needed, we're still going to be left with having to ultimately reduce all the carbon dioxide that still exists within the atmosphere. And ultimately nature, the life forms that sustain us, they are our greatest carbon sink. And more specifically, the biodiverse systems are our greatest carbon sink. And so effectively there is no net zero without nature, and that we need to be thinking about how we address that.
Thanks, Sue.
And I totally agree with the comments that have already been made on the panel, and I would add that it's certainly clear from our work with farmers, but also from the conversations that I'm having here at COP, is that one of the really important reasons that nature's coming into focus, not only for decarbonisation, but it's also for food security and economic prosperity. And so as we think about nature, we need to be making sure that we're understanding that while addressing climate change is exceptionally important, we have to do it in a way that's also maintaining and improving food security and resilience.
Can I build on one? Sorry, I was told to encourage to build. Great. Building from Liam's point, I guess I have come from a background which began with nature, as in it began with the planet rather than beginning with climate. And I know for many the concept of Earth systems might sound very techy, but actually if you look at the planetary boundaries concept, we're basically living on one planet, and we know from the concept of Earth overshoot, right, we're using the equivalent of, I can't remember what the latest was, 1.6 planets. I mean, we're obviously way over. The concept of planetary boundaries, when taken into the science, shows that we're outside of the safe operating space of 6 of the 9 boundaries, climate being 1. So it's not just climate and nature, right? I know that helps people thinking about climate to bridge to why nature is relevant, but actually it's a much bigger agenda. We have, one home that provides all the services we depend on, not only from a private sector perspective for economic activity, but for life itself. And these systems are fundamental for our surviving and thriving. And so I think it's that frame that we're kind of maturing into, from having thought about climate, but maturing into that bigger understanding.
And I think that's been a bit of a theme at this COP, particularly around the Declaration on Food and Ag, which is really looking across dimensions, people, livelihoods, health, nutrition, and I think I agree, it's a kind of maturing and sort of leaning into the complexity of these systems, because they're not as simple as we'd like them to be. Okay, so we've talked a lot about risks. But one of the things about the TNFD in particular, and a lot of the work that you both do at Climateworks Centre and Sue in Farming for the Future, is about revealing opportunities. What kind of opportunities can be unlocked for system actors around measuring and managing nature? I might start with you, Sue.
Okay. So what we're seeing, and the purpose of our research, is really to actually understand whether if a farmer invests in their natural capital, the natural resources that support their businesses, if they act to improve their environmental performance, does it come at a cost to the farm business? Or can they actually generate a broad range of ecosystem services that they can use as core inputs to the farm business, and therefore improve the productivity, profitability and resilience of the business? And so when we think about nature, we think about revealing those opportunities. When and where do they happen? Why do they happen? What drives them? So that we can help other farmers adopt leading edge practices. And I think the other thing that is revealed by looking at this space as an opportunity space, what I would say, and we'll probably get onto this later in the panel, is that when we look at how we would measure nature in order to reveal these opportunities and reveal how we're tracking to realise the benefit of the opportunities, a huge opportunity and challenge for ag tech, for nature tech and for fintech, so enormous opportunities for technology developers to really assist in improving the quality of the data that we can get, reducing the cost of acquisition and improving people's ability to use it. So I actually view all of this activity in decarbonising agriculture and bringing nature into the centre of the frame as a massive stack of opportunities.
First of all, I think I am someone that's guilty of perhaps focusing on the risks more than the opportunities at times. But yeah, when I think about the opportunities question, I sort of ask first about opportunities for whom. I come from this, first and foremost, I guess, well, start with the sort of land manager's perspective. In our current economic system, land managers aren't necessarily rewarded for the goods and services that they provide, the public goods and services that they provide through their land stewardship. And I think there's tremendous opportunity to change that system and see that those land managers are rewarded. I think there are different ways of sort of thinking about this as sort of reflected in different parts of the world. And what I mean by that is, in some parts of the world, they're exploring opportunities for sort of public payments for public goods type schemes, particularly in parts of Europe and the UK. I think that potentially will offer an opportunity for land managers moving forward. And then in other parts of the world, there's more emphasis being placed on newly emerging auxiliary markets or markets for nature. And these markets will potentially offer opportunities for land managers, opportunities for major corporate actors as well. But how that is actually managed is going to be important. Alongside the TNFD, there is another task force, the Task Force for, I think, Nature Markets. I might have got that one wrong. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the work that they're doing develops alongside the TNFD and what that might offer in terms of opportunities moving forward.
The TNFD framework has these 4 basic concepts when we think about how business interacts with nature, that a business will have impacts, which could be negative or positive on nature, and depends on nature for the services it provides. And there's a feedback loop there, right? So if you have a company that's depending on water, but yet its activities on extracting water, it's sort of undermining its own dependence. And that those create both risks and opportunities. And our sister organisation that we're sort of inspired by, the TCFD that looks at climate, also had risks and opportunities there, but really had a very strong focus on risk, I think. So we've also taken that, but tried to add more depth on this opportunity angle because we think it's so important. And we have a kind of categorization of different types of opportunity from the perspective of outcomes for nature and for the business itself. And for outcomes for nature, the way I sort of conceive of this is, again, going back to that sort of Earth overshoot concept, we have opportunities to for companies to reduce their negative impacts, right? That comes back to a lot of work on circular economy, reduce, reuse, recycle, the efficiency with which you're extracting, reducing pollutants and waste. And that's important. That in itself is an opportunity, and there are tremendous opportunities for new business models that are reducing negative impacts. Then we also know we need to go beyond just reducing the negative to actually, because we're already outside of those safe operating spaces, we need to be not just reversing nature loss, but bringing up to a safe space. And that's where we're looking at conservation, because the magic of nature is it naturally regenerates. So protected areas are a great investment. And active regenerative and restoration activities. So that's from the most important perspective, which is sort of opportunities for nature. But that wonderful thing is that can create opportunities for business. There are new markets, new products and services. There are reputational benefits, and there are access to capital, because financial markets are also recognizing this. Investors are recognizing this as an area that they wish to be investing in. It creates opportunities for, reduced cost financing and so on. So it's exciting time, and I mean, in the sessions I've only been in a day and a half, but everybody wants to talk about opportunities, So it's now up to us to make sure that they are real, and the Task Force on Nature Markets is one that's been thinking about what the governance needs to be to make these markets credible, to make sure that they don't suffer from some of the, crinkles that have been there for others.
Thank you. So just in the short few minutes that we've been talking, we've heard a number of terms. We've talked about nature, we've talked about natural capital, we've talked about ecosystem services. Why are these terms important? How do we make this more tractable for people? What does natural capital mean? Are there better ways, more effective ways of describing nature to be able to incorporate them in our decision making? Liam, I might start with you on this one.
Sure. So for me, the term natural capital is a different way of thinking about and conceptualizing nature. So it's an approach which seeks to demonstrate the benefits that nature provides to people, and particularly the economic benefits that they provide. And there's a real focus on ecosystem services, those benefits, and really demonstrating the instrumental value that we derive from those particular assets. And that is a little bit different to, say, thinking about something like the inherent value of nature, which is where a lot of emphasis has been placed traditionally. Previously, a lot of organizations have had a focus on how do we demonstrate and talk about the inherent value of nature. But there's been this shift into sort of talking about and demonstrating the benefits that nature provides for people. And in some ways, I think that those two approaches can be complementary. But yeah, in a sense, it is a new way of thinking about this, and it's all really about sort of how do we ultimately sort of establish an economic solution to some of these pressing environmental problems.
What about you, Emily? How is it best for us to think about nature?
And I agree with Liam. There are really important debates about terminology, and they're very meaningful. But I've come to the conclusion that it's different horses for different courses. It's okay to use different terms for different purposes. In the TNFD framework, we have used the terms natural capital to demonstrate, as Liam was saying, that nature is an asset that is perhaps our most important asset that provides critical benefits to us. We have produced capital, we have human capital, and we have natural capital. It's to emphasize that it's this stock of assets that provides this flow of critical benefits. But of course, in other circles, in IPBES, which is the equivalent of the IPCC, there were very important debates about the use of the term ecosystem services, and they landed on nature's contributions to people. And that was to emphasize these connections, particularly from indigenous peoples and local communities with nature. So the use of the term ecosystem services is not to say we don't understand the importance of those linkages. It's just for certain contexts with business and finance, it's an easier term to grasp. And of course, none of this is to undermine the importance, just like education or health. You can think of these as sources of capital, but there are many, many meaningful sort of intrinsic, not just the intrinsic value of nature, but the interconnections, the deep interconnections of all of us with nature, in particular the role of indigenous peoples with nature. So I think it's to emphasize, as Liam was saying, it's a source of economic benefit, but that's not to diminish the, of course, multifaceted, fundamental nature of our relationship with it as the source of our spirituality and connection and so on.
Yeah, there has been that critique, hasn't there, levelled at the sort of commodification of nature. Sue, why is natural capital an important term for you, and do you think there are other more helpful ways in the sectors that you work to kind of use other terms interchangeably?
Yeah, so I think we have to bear into consideration the scale at which you're asking these questions is really important. So for a global bank to be thinking about natural capital, maybe they don't need to drill under what do you mean by natural capital? But when you're thinking about a farm, and the farmer is making decisions about how they might change their portfolio of assets on the farm, what we find is very, very helpful is to describe the natural capital of a farm as being the different ecosystem types that you'd see on a farm. So the remnant native vegetation that's providing habitat for koalas and kangaroos and things. The grassy woodlands that provide really great biodiversity and carbon, but are also able to be grazed by livestock and keep them in very good condition. We would consider cultivated intensively managed cropping soils as an ecosystem asset of a farm, just like we would include vineyards and orchards, shelter belts, environmental plantings, creeks, of course soil. And depending on how those assets are configured on a farm is better able to capture free inputs of sunlight and rainfall and turn it into food, fibre and beverages for us. And so when we think of those different ecosystem assets of a farm, you can quantify how big they are and what their condition is. That's quite easy. And then you can think about the attributes of biodiversity and carbon. So we view biodiversity and carbon as attributes of ecosystems, just like flavour can be attributes of a meal. So in the same way as a meal can be hot or cold or spicy or sour, ecosystem assets can have lots of biodiversity and carbon or not very much. The remnant native vegetation, very, very high in carbon and biodiversity, doesn't produce much food. The intensified cropping soil, not so much biodiversity and carbon, but does produce a lot of food. So because we work at farm scale, we find actually making it really tractable in that way so that farmers recognise this as not a new thing, but actually things they've been managing forever. And that's really important to our work. And it also means that we've got the potential of aggregating that information up so that we can give businesses like the ones that Emily works with the ability to understand whether the natural capital in their portfolio is improving or degrading.
Great segue to my next question. So really what we're talking about is about this idea of really thinking about nature or natural capital and measuring it and managing it. Businesses, whether they be small farm businesses or very large multinationals, are quite overwhelmed by this idea at the moment. This seems very hard and very overwhelming, and a range of tools like the TNFD are emerging to kind of smooth the wheels of that process. Why do people think it's hard? Is it hard? And how can tools like the TNFD or other mechanisms make this easier for small and large businesses? Emily, I'll start with you.
I think organisations think it's hard because it's more multifaceted than climate. So usually these conversations begin with, but we just have greenhouse gas emissions and temperatures for climate. Nature, where do we even start? So it's multidimensional. We talk about the 4 realms of land, ocean, freshwater, and atmosphere. You've also got air quality as well as climate, right, up in the atmosphere. And then we've just talked about different ecosystems, different services. It's sort of how do you make sense of all of this? So part of that's the kind of the conceptual framing. How do you understand nature? How do you break it down? And then how do you get to measurement? Measurement's also overwhelming. I mean, we overwhelmed ourselves at TNFD because when I first started, I said we'd do a landscape assessment with the task force of all the indicators and metrics that relate to nature in existing standards. And we got to 3,000, and then I was like, right, we'll stop. I think we've got most of them now. We're going to consolidate because the market doesn't want 3,000 metrics. So what we've managed to do, I think, in TNFD, which I hope will prove useful, I think it's already proved useful in the pilot testing we've done with about 240 organisations, is help at both those levels to create that conceptual understanding. You think of 4 realms of nature. Think of, okay, we have natural capital. It's broken down into assets. This is all from the UN statistical standards. We have ecosystem assets. What are the different ecosystems? What are the biomes? We have, I can't remember, is it 29 biomes? then each of those biomes delivers services, right? Again, we go to the UN statistical standard. What are those services? So we have what we call our periodic table. It's just this one image that says, okay, 4 realms, this many biomes, this many services. Okay, I'm starting to understand this concept that I've got to measure. And then we, at the next level down, have created a measurement architecture for assessment and also for disclosure. The assessment, and this is where we actually list out indicators and associated metrics. Of course, for assessment, that's vast. It could go on forever. We're not saying we've got the endless list. It's not comprehensive, but at least it provides structure. And then for disclosure, can't really do this with my microphone. We've kind of created a funnel. So you take all of those assessment metrics and then you want to create a funnel, because for disclosure, investors don't want lots and lots of metrics. They want to be able to compare and get consistent measurement within sectors and across sectors in very complex portfolios. So that's where we've then taken a funnel to get to a smaller set of metrics, and at the tip of the funnel is just 14. There are 9 that relate to impacts and dependencies. They're the equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions. How are you driving impact, whether that's pollutants to soil or pollutants to water or extraction of resources, water usage. So those are 9, and then we have 5 that relate to risks and opportunities. But then we also, importantly, have a few that we've called placeholder indicators, and this is where actually the science community is giving us steers about what the indicators should be, but there's still quite a lot to get precise about what the metrics should be. So that's why we've said we know we need to do this. We need to look at ecosystem condition and extent, just as you're looking at, Sue. We need to look at species extinction risk and abundance, but exactly which metrics to use, we're waiting for the scientists to tell us. And so we're encouraging businesses and finance to start doing that measurement. We're actually later this week publishing a discussion paper on footprint metrics as well. But we need to work with this at the pace of the science community to get to more precise specification. So hopefully we're hoping that makes it more manageable, both for sort of understanding the concepts and knowing which indicators and metrics to use. And that's been building on the work of others, including Climateworks in Sue's great work.
Liam, is it hard?
Is it hard? Well, I think along the lines of what Emily was saying, I think for a lot of companies to go from having one sort of single metric in carbon equivalence and then having to think about a broader suite of metrics is certainly going to be a bit more challenging. I think, though, one thing that I'm sort of focused on is there is sometimes this idea that this is all incredibly new. And sometimes I feel like possibly need to challenge that a bit. I think it was explained that Emily was involved in helping to establish the Natural Capital Protocol. That was quite some time ago. And there were lots of companies that participated in that process that sort of started to get to grips with how you might think about measuring your impacts and dependencies on nature. And so this idea that it's all completely new, I think we do need to sort of possibly push back against a little bit. The other thing as well is that whilst this process of sort of measuring and assessing and then ultimately disclosing is quite new, I think there's also a lot of action that companies are already undertaking to address their nature-related risks and opportunities. There are already actions that companies are taking to tackle deforestation, both in their immediate operations and their supply chains. There are already things that companies are doing to address issues related to water scarcity. So, there is action being taken on nature, and that perhaps is probably a good starting point for a lot of these companies, rather than sort of thinking that they're starting at the beginning of something.
Sue, I mean, you're working with very different types of businesses, small businesses, farmers. How hard is it? And how important is it for farmers to do this?
Well, everything's hard when it's new, and everything's a little bit harder when the tools haven't been developed. So what I would say is that it's not hard, it's actually tractable, would be the word I would use. And I might be being overly optimistic, but I don't think it's that hard. I really don't think it's that hard. Certainly not at the scale we're working at. So, yeah, I don't think it's that hard.
Yeah, I'd love to just build on that, because I was talking at sort of that level, but then building on your very beautiful, succinct response. Once you've got consensus on the understanding and the measurement and you're doing it in practice, you come to the data. And one of the first things, again, when I started with TNFD 2 years ago, I kept hearing they can't get started with nature because there's no data. And one of our co-chairs is David Craig, who founded Refinitiv, and we sort of looked at each other in the eye and said, I think we better blast this one. So we did a landscape assessment of all the different data and analytics that's out there, and there's plenty of data. The data being out there is not the problem, it's the consistency of that data. There are some gaps, sort of standardization, access, of course. So I think it's sort of starting some nuance there to the data access. Again, we have set up a tools catalog, which is sort of data and analytics tools, and that's blossoming. We heard a critique yesterday, I think, in a session Sue and I were at, that there were too many tools now. There's 135 tools in our catalog, but that's because there's innovation. Once this becomes a market like it has, because people are now interested to do this analysis, that innovation for the data and the analytics on top of the raw data is going to, I think, continue to rapidly improve.
And before you take over, Chair, I would just like to point out that because we work at farm scale, we have become painfully aware of the inaccuracy of the publicly available data sets. So what I would say needs to be said is use of those publicly available data sets in order to measure the environmental performance and natural capital of farms probably should be done with extreme caution, particularly if the consequences of the measurement you make could remove a farmer's access to markets or accuse them of something. So what we would say, and the publicly available data sets were not designed or built for farm scale. So I'm not saying that they've done anything wrong. They're absolutely fit for the purpose that they were designed for, and they work beautifully. But when we're looking at farm scale, what we have the opportunity and need to do is to invest further in those tools so that when we can assess what farmers are actually doing, the assessment is just and fair.
So we're going to stick with this topic because this is sort of the nub of the session, the sort of the data question, and data as a driver for change. You know, and as you've alluded to, Emily, you know, there's this view that there's too much data, we have everything we need. Others say we don't have the data that we need, there's not enough. And there's another view, which is actually you've just got to have the right data depending on who you're talking about. And I think that's what you're getting at, Sue. So we'll come back to you on that. But Liam, I might go to you. How do you view the data challenge?
Well, I think in talking about data, it can sometimes feel quite abstract. So I might provide an example to explain a bit how I'm thinking about things at the moment. And to do that, I just might explain a bit about some of the work that we're doing. So we have a program in Australia called the Natural Capital Investment Initiative. Through that, we've developed this open resource called the Natural Capital Measurement Catalogue that's helping to promote consistency around measurement of natural capital, both across public and private spheres. And we developed this resource, but as part of that, we're also doing some piloting with some major actors in Australia, a major retailer and a major bank, and exploring what it means to actually measure their impacts and dependencies. And what we're doing at the moment is we are looking at the opportunities provided through remote sensing technologies. There's a lot of really important work that's going on, sort of the boots on the ground work that Sue is undertaking, but we're essentially exploring what it's going to take to scale things like remote sensing moving forward. And we've been engaging with a lot of tech providers in Australia, sort of a good 8 to 10 of them, and we've taken a selection of the metrics from the Natural Capital Measurement Catalogue that are aligned with the TNFD and sort of said to them, which of these, metrics can you provide methods against? And, there was no one service provider that could actually, accurately sort of measure against all of the metrics. So that in itself is, I guess, sort of interesting. But in talking to one of those actors, it became aware that one of them, has essentially LiDAR data for the whole of Australia. And in very simple terms, the difference between sort of satellite data and LiDAR data, the way it was explained to me, satellite data is like having an X-ray done, sort of LiDAR data is more like an MRI. And so sort of higher levels of resolution through that. But what that sort of got me thinking is, imagine if we did have, publicly available, accessible LiDAR data for the whole of Australia, and what would that mean? And what that sort of points to is, I think there are some limitations in the private sector, but they'll probably address those moving forward. And there are also some opportunities in the public sector as well, and it's how both public and private are going to work together to address those gaps and ultimately establish the measurement systems moving forward. That's going to be a really interesting space for me.
Thanks, Liam. Sue, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this. What's the data challenge? I mean, you started talking about it, but let's go a bit further.
Yeah, I think the data opportunity probably is to be, and I totally agree with Emily that all of this opportunity is actually unlocked by having some concepts and terminology and standards for how we describe things, so that we know that we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about different measurement concepts. And I think the opportunity, therefore, is to really get quickly to the point where we've got that sort of standardisation of concept and metric definitions, because then I think what we can do is we can unleash the power of technology to start to get the data together and make it tractable. As Liam's described, the developments are just astronomical in pace. And so I'm very, very optimistic that we've got solutions coming up pretty quickly. And so I don't view the data question so much as an intractable challenge. I actually view it as an amazing opportunity.
But I guess there is an opportunity, certainly from what we've seen in your work in agriculture, that the more useful that data is for the person who is collecting it at that level to make decisions other than just for reporting is going to be really important.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. One of the things that I should have mentioned before is that our main purpose in Farming for the Future and collecting data is to be able to put data into the hands of the farmer to help them to manage. That's our most important priority. And I'll explain it this way. Farmers are at the front line of climate change. They're at the front line of food security. They are the ones that need to have information optimised and designed so that when they make decisions, they're making their decisions with the best possible information. And then from that point of view, the role of all of the rest of us, including people who are measuring in the TNFD, is actually to create the environment of terms and conditions, trade relationships, etc., that enable farmers to use that information to the best possible ability, whether it's by helping to create the data sources, whether it's by creating the conditions under which their decisions are rewarded, whether it's creating other incentive programs or other support programs that enable them. So
teeing off what Sue was saying about what this linkage is going to be between the public information and the private sector information. The UN system of environmental ecosystem accounting, which is a mouthful, so the UNCA has ecosystem accounting. There are now quite a few countries, I can't remember how many, it's either close to 100 or more who are developing ecosystem accounts. So that's a source of information for the private sector with the caveats that you added, right? You need to think about the scale and the appropriate. That's a really important source of information for the private sector when they're thinking about assessment and disclosure. But then many businesses are also collecting this information with these exciting new technologies, environmental DNA collection or acoustic monitoring. So then there's a question of how does that sharing take place from the private sector to others? How do we build a system that works for all of the different decisions that are made? And this is just starting to explore it. We don't know what the solutions are, but we did a scoping study in the summer looking at the need for a data facility. And just it's very sort of rapid scoping. We're now going to look at it in more detail and further consultation. But it came to the conclusion that there is a gap on state of nature data, and that some sort of federated model with kind of global dated standards devolved down to sort of national level development could work well. So we're going to continue to explore that to try to address some of these gaps, and then drawing a system together that can bring the public-private data collection together.
Thank you. All right, so let's just be reminded that we're at a COP. So we've gone deep on nature and measurement. Let's talk about the role of nature-based solutions and data and measurement and management to be able to make nature-based, particularly the Australian nature-based solutions opportunity real. You know, we are an enormous continent with huge opportunities. We've got First Nations people managing nature. We've got agriculture being a huge part of that landscape as well. Liam, I'm going to start with you. What do we need to do to make Australia's opportunity around nature-based solutions truly investable?
Well, I think one of the first things we need to do is we need to be clear on what we mean by nature-based solutions, because I think, you know, that term is used all over the place at COP, and it might feel like everyone has the same view on what is meant by nature-based solutions, but I think a lot of the time with some of the stakeholders that we're talking to, they are sort of primarily talking about nature-based solutions for climate. They're thinking specifically about mitigation, and I think it's important that we think about it in a different way. So I think if you sort of look at what the IUCN has put out around nature-based solutions, the standards and criteria, I won't go through all of them now, but one of the things that they encourage is you know, not only is it's, you know, these solutions supporting sort of mitigation objectives potentially, but also being sort of biodiversity positive at the same time. So I think just kind of, you know, establishing what we mean by that and making sure that we're not just focusing purely on mitigation objectives is important. In terms of what's going to make them investable, there's a whole range of things that could be said, but I think for me, just really sort of how you actually measure and sort of determine whether sort of these interventions are actually having an impact, and thinking about sort of measurement and some of the integrity issues associated with that.
Emily, did you have any comments on? No?
I dread to say what should be done in Australia.
Well, anywhere. I mean, these are global problems.
Yeah. Well, I've been really impressed by, just coming back to Australia, the pilot testing of the TNFD. We've had a large number of pilot testing organisations in Australia, and really grounded in doing things that are tangible. Nature-based solutions can sound like a concept, but actually bringing it to the ground. So continuing to learn by doing, it just seems like a hugely important exercise. I completely agree with Liam's point on definitions. Our definition in the TNFD of framework of I think it's the IUCN one, is broader. It's about a nature-based solution can provide a variety of benefits to all of us, including on climate mitigation, but many others. And I agree with Liam on measurement as well. I will hand to you.
Well, of course, I think about investable solutions from a farmer perspective. And so making it really tractable again, what we're talking about is investment in shelter belts. We're talking about investment in pasture quality. We're talking about investment in soil health. So to make something investable from a farmer perspective, they need to know the return on investment, the time to return, the cost of transition, whether there are other risks that they need to know about. Anyone buying farmland has the same questions. And again, I think that if we can be starting to investigate what sort of sounds pretty pragmatic and boring, I actually think that if we put some monetary values on the net present value of a grassy woodland as a storm refuge for a sheep producer, if it saves, you know, avoids the loss of 10% of the lambs or a few of the ewes, you know, that can actually be pretty significant to a farm business. And so let's not underestimate the power of actually looking at that very micro scale and thinking about investability from the point of view of the land managers that we're relying on to not only look after nature, but actually to feed us and clothe us.
Okay, I'm going to ask one final question, and we'll ask for a very short response from each of you, and then I'm going to open up for questions to the audience. But thinking about the point that you raised, Liam, around integrity, there's been a lot of talk around greenwashing. You know, there's a lot of need for public trust around these mechanisms, these tools, these statements that businesses make. For the measurement and management of nature to be real and accelerated, and for disclosure frameworks and other tools to be incorporated, what needs to happen, and what needs to happen soon?
I'll make a start. So I think for me, it comes to sort of the point that Emily was making around both public and private, and just how those sort of actors are going to work together to develop those measurement and data collection systems that are going to support, you know, TNFD assessments moving forward. So I'm just sort of fascinated to see what that looks like moving forward, and I'll keep it short and say that.
My short answer would be that one of the most important things in ensuring integrity is when we're thinking about some of the tech that I've been advocating for, can often be a black box. And so you're taking the provider's word for it, that, you know, it's good oil and not snake oil. And so what I would suggest is that having some open standards and some independent quality assurance for those measurement systems would be a very important way of ensuring integrity.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, 3 things: building capacity, addressing remaining data and measurement challenges, and 3 would be increasing what I think is already happening with greater consistency and alignment in this whole space.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. Let's take some questions. Does anyone have any questions for our panellists? Trudy's going to help me with the mic.
Thank you very much. I'm not Australian, so but I try to be very constructive to Australian possibility of selling your NBS. But my background is, okay, I'm in the TNFD task force and belonging to the data working group. And within that data working group, or beyond that data working group, we always talk about the issue of aggregation of data. Because this is also very important, for instance, in the farm level. That's fine if it's for local to local. But if you want to sell your local, how can I say, certified credit to global market, as far as it's only for GHG, that's fine because it's global, but it's about nature, that is location specific, so probably global investor cannot understand what the real meaning of your farmer's effort. So how we can really, how can I say, overcome that kind of aggregation issue for nature data? If you have any kind of good suggestion, or if you have any kind of trial, because otherwise, if you are really trying to very beautiful NBS project in Australia, probably Japanese investors do not understand the real meaning of that kind of premium price if you combine with your carbon credit under the name of whatever, biodiversity credit or co-benefit, blah, blah, blah. Because we don't understand what kind of the meaning of the core benefit, and probably corporate side or investor side really want to sell their contribution to what. But without understanding to what, they do not ever purchase that premium. So how do you think of it?
Great question. Sue, would you like to take that first, or who would like to take that?
I was thinking that Emily should have a go at that one.
Emily will, I'm sure, but...
But I'll have a little go. So this might be getting too geeky, so put hands up in the audience if I'm getting too geeky, but let's say that all farms in Australia were able to measure the extent and condition of different ecosystem types, then we should be able to say that farms in the sheep wheat zone of Eastern Australia are conserving X million hectares of grassy woodland in reference condition, Y million hectares of grassy woodlands that are transitioning, and Z million hectares of derived grasslands. You know, perfectly tractable information. If we look at the biodiversity attributes of those combinations, we should be able to say something like, you know, 70% of the native biodiversity is being conserved in the sheep wheat zone. And we can also add up very easily numbers about the amount of carbon that's stored and the rate of carbon sequestration or emission, all perfectly amenable to aggregation. I think that what needs to be explored, which is why I'm going to hand the mic back to Emily and then possibly Liam, is the question of materiality. Because when you are Lloyd's of London or BlackRock investors, you need to be understanding what's material to you. And so if changes to biodiversity are material and carbon is material, but they don't really care about whether it's grassy woodlands or not, then I think that's the sort of exploration we're yet to do, because if information doesn't have the power to change a decision, then there's not much use in collecting it. Emily?
I just heard the term materiality got 1 minute to go, so I'm sure I don't have to answer it. No, I'm joking.
We were a bit late.
I'm joking. I'll do it really soon. So Makako, it's great to be here with my fellow task force member. Yeah, what we have said on aggregation is aligned with the ISSB, which has developed that global sustainability reporting baseline, which is should only aggregate information to the extent that it doesn't cover what would be material to you. So this materiality issue and aggregation's closely connected. So for example, you shouldn't be aggregating water usage in a water-stressed area with an area which has got plentiful water supply and conglomerating it, because that hides information that investors would want to know, because you're going to face likely higher exposure to risk in the water-stressed areas. So that's the principle we've set out. As Makako has now shown, how that works in practice, I agree with you. I think that many of the metrics we've got as our core set are easily aggregated, but it's when you then get to the state of nature measurement, and please, do you think it's going to be feasible? We've looked at things like ecosystem extent and condition, which seem to me to be feasible, but there's going to be location-specific characteristics that relate to material information that we would always want to be exposed, and investors, there's only so much information they can take into account. So we'll continue to make progress, won't we, Makako, together?
Liam, did you want to add anything to that? Okay. I think we have to wrap up. Thank you to our co-host, Climateworks. Thank you to our panellists. Thank you to the audience. I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks to the Australian government for hosting us here.